Hello, everyone. I think we will go ahead and get started. So first and foremost, thank you for joining us for our first Fort Worth Science Cafe event. My name is Marlo Jeffries, and I am one of the co-founders of Fort Worth Science Cafe. Before we get started, I would like to tell you just a little bit more about Science Cafe and introduce you to the team that has made a Fort Worth Cafe series possible. So the Science Cafe movement actually began in the late 1990s in England and France, and since then it has traveled across the globe and has become a really popular event in a lot of places. So science cafes are grassroots organized events that seek to make science accessible to the public at large. Essentially, they help connect local citizens with the scientists that live and work in their communities. Often science cafes take place in cafes, hence the name, restaurants or pubs, which obviously helps to create a really fun and informal environment where we can all learn about different topics within the sciences. So for the past several months, I have been working with a fantastic group of individuals who are really committed to this cause of helping engage the public with science. So I'd like to take just a few moments to introduce to you the team. So we have Mags Ricky, Eric Gonzalez, and Tracy Sintani. And really without them, this event would not be possible. We actually started our discussions of a Fort Worth Science Cafe all the way back in April, so almost a full year ago. A lot of our efforts got put on hold because of COVID, the need for social distancing, and of course, last month's winter storm. So I think I speak on behalf of the four of us when I tell you how excited we are to be able to bring Science Cafe to you. And we are so excited that you have chosen to join us. We hope that you leave tonight's event having learned something new and having some really fun and exciting information to share with your friends and family. We also hope that you will encourage your friends and family to engage with us in future Fort Worth Science Cafe events. So tonight's event is going to be moderated by Tracy and Eric. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Tracy and Eric, who can get our discussion of science started.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Marlo. So to get us started, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our guest for tonight. Dr. Sarah Hill is a professor of psychology at TCU. She's got a very fascinating and productive research program at TCU. She's also the author of the book called This Is Your Brain on Birth Control: The Surprising Science of Women, Hormones, and the Law of Unintended Consequences. And so our goal for tonight is to have a conversation with Sarah about her work and about the content of the book. So of course, we would prefer to be doing this in person in a cafe or pub, but we want to try and capture as much of that casual conversation, engaging conversation as we can. So if you have questions for Sarah at any point during tonight's conversation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom, and that will be moderated by the panelists. So we are the only ones that will be able to see your questions, and we will of course pass them on to Sarah. So please use the Q&A at any point, and we'll try and interject your questions throughout the conversation. So I'll turn it over to Eric, who's going to get us started with our first questions for Sarah.
All right, thank you, Tracy. Dr. Sarah Hill, thank you for joining us today. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I was just telling you all that I was on TCU's beautiful campus today, and it's just like a beautiful day, and the flowers are out, and I was happy to see the tulips, the purple and white tulips are planted, and so it's a great day.
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. Thank you. Before we get into some of the other questions, I just had a quick question of what inspired you to write this book? It's such a fascinating read, and I think our audience would love to hear what really was the inspiration behind it.
Well, as I discuss in the book, I've spent most of my career studying women and understanding motivation and understanding different types of biological influences on women's behavior. So I didn't really study, I'd never really gotten into the domain of the birth control pill specifically. But I'd sort of been touching around those areas. So I'd studied like the influence of hormones on women's behavior and all these other things. But I didn't think too much about the birth control pill until I stopped using it. And so I was on hormonal birth control for more than a decade of my life. And then when I went off of it, within about 3 months, I just felt like I'd woken up. Everything seemed like I felt sort of like I was crawling out of a black and white, like one-dimensional drawing into like real, like colorful, three-dimensional life. And I thought, well, this is curious. Like, this is an interesting, thing to have happen. And I didn't really think too much of it. Like, I filed that away in the back of my brain as like, wow, I sure did feel different when I went off of my birth control pills. But then I was at a research talk about it was probably about a year after I discontinued birth control pills. And the researcher had mentioned in his study, he was talking about some research he had done looking at the stress response. And he had just mentioned offhand that they had to drop all of the women from the analysis in their study because almost all of the women were on hormonal birth control, and women who are on hormonal birth control don't get a cortisol change. And cortisol, of course, is a stress hormone that gets released when we're stressed out. He'd mentioned that women who are on hormonal birth control don't experience a cortisol increase in response to stress. And it was like at that moment that I was like, wait, what? Like, what? And so I talked to him afterwards, and he said, oh no, that's something it's been in the literature for 20 years. Like, women who are on hormonal birth control, even though every other healthy functioning adult releases cortisol in response to stressors, these women don't. And given that that's something that's like a hallmark symptom of things like post-traumatic stress disorder and other types of stress dysregulation diseases, it got me really interested in like, what else does hormonal birth control do? And so I went to the research literature, and I went and downloaded every paper I could get my hands on that had anything to do with hormonal birth control and anything related to the brain and related to psychology. And then I spent the next, several years reading through all of this and digesting it, and then being able to provide that information to other women. Oh, I'm not hearing you. I don't know if other people are.
I hit the mute on my microphone.
Oh.
My apologies for that. So you had already mentioned one of the terms of female hormonal contraception, the big part of your book, obviously. Can you first tell us what contraceptives fall into this category, and also tell us how they work to prevent pregnancy?
Yeah, absolutely. So any hormonal birth control is just any birth control that you use that contains hormones. So this includes combination oral contraceptive pills. This includes like the hormonal birth control patch. The birth control shot is hormones. The hormonal IUD, so usually under the brand names Mirena or Skyla. All of these, and I think that covers all of them. And then the vaginal ring is also that's also has hormones. And the way that these contraceptives work is that they give the body a steady dose of synthetic hormones, right? So every day you're getting this dose of relatively high level of synthetic progesterone or progestin, and then a relatively low level of estradiol or estrogen. And this hormonal message is actually, it suppresses the release of the precursor hormones that initiate ovulation. And the reason that it works this way is because over the course of a natural cycle, so for a woman who's a naturally cycling non-hormonal birth control user, during the early part of the cycle, when ovulation is getting kickstarted, these precursor hormones get released from the brain into the pituitary, and then that stimulate the ovaries, and that causes the ovaries to begin to mature an egg. And these things start, this like sort of hormonal process gets initiated when women's own levels of sex hormones are low. So when women's levels of progesterone and estrogen are low, that tells the brain, uh-oh, there's nothing happening here. Like, let's go ahead and initiate some egg development and get something going here. But when hormones are high, in particular, when progesterone is high, that sends a signal to the brain that an egg has already been released. And so that actually suppresses the hormonal cascade that initiates in ovulation. And so having the same daily hormonal message of relatively high levels of progesterone and relatively low levels of estradiol fools the brain into thinking that it's just ovulated. That is, that an egg has just been released. And so it's not doing anything to initiate egg development.
Okay. So are there other benefits beside preventing pregnancy associated with these contraceptives?
Yeah, so a lot of women are prescribed oral contraceptives for things like if their skin is breaking out. So these pills, because they keep hormone levels relatively constant, and because they keep testosterone levels generally pretty low, they can be clearing for the skin. So it can clear up the skin. It also, is frequently used by women who get endometriosis. So endometriosis is a condition that women can get where their endometrium, or the endometrial layer that builds up in their uterus each month in preparation for the possibility of a pregnancy. During endometriosis, you get an overgrowth of endometrial tissue. And because hormonal birth control keeps women's own levels of hormones really low, and it's preventing all of those events that the body usually engages in to sort of prepare the body for pregnancy, it prevents proliferation within the uterus. So it's sometimes used for treatment of endometriosis because it does minimize proliferation of cells within the endometrial layer. Some women also take it because they have painful or irregular periods. And so when you take hormonal birth control, given that it is suppressing the activities of the brain ovarian axis, because that's going on, it's of course suppressing your actual period, and instead you're able to get this like monthly breakthrough bleed that occurs when you go on the placebo pills on your hormonal contraceptive. And so women who have issues related to their menstrual cycles will frequently be prescribed hormonal birth control because this of course minimizes the symptomology associated with those things, and then also like the skin clearing benefits. And some women are also prescribed hormonal birth control for severe premenstrual syndrome. Some women experience PMS or premenstrual syndrome because their body doesn't really respond very well to the hormonal fluctuations that occur over the course of a natural cycle. And for some women who have this condition, taking hormonal birth control, because it provides the same steady hormonal message every day of the cycle, for those women, it can actually be therapeutic, and it can sort of minimize the amount of mood fluctuations that they get over the course of a cycle. And that can be used to treat that as well.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned a lot of this regulation going on in the body, and in your book, you also talk about how there's so many hormones at play anyway. When you think of the pill, it's another medication, if you will. And so what are some of the adverse effects women should consider when thinking about if the hormonal birth control is going to be right for them?
Right. Well, I mean, one of the things, and this is one of the ones that you'll hear at the doctor's office. And this is like, whenever you're taking something that has estradiol in it or estrogen, that's something that is associated with cardiovascular events. And so you will sometimes hear that women, particularly women who are over 35 and have underlying health conditions, like, for example, if they're smokers, or if they have hypertension, or if they have heart-related, anything that's associated with heart-related issues, that they're at a greater risk of developing a stroke or having a heart attack. And so like, that's one potential, of course, like incredibly devastating side effect. But in terms of psychological side effects, You know, women sort of, they run the whole spectrum. You know, the research shows that about half of women who are prescribed oral contraceptive or hormonal birth control, roughly half of women who are prescribed it discontinue it within 3 months of use. And the reason that most of the women discontinue it, these women who do discontinue it, the reason that they discontinue it is because of unpleasant side effects. And the one unpleasant side effect that women report being most frequently the reason that they're discontinuing their hormonal birth control is unpleasant mood-related changes. And so we know from the research now, and there's been, you know, some pretty compelling evidence demonstrating that for some women, hormonal birth control can increase the risk of depression. And in this research, you know, it's been going on for several decades now, where they've been investigating the links between mental health and hormonal birth control use. And very recently, so maybe 2 years ago, there was this really fantastic study that came out of Denmark, where they looked at the entire population of Denmark, aged 15 to 35. And in Denmark, you know, these Scandinavian countries are fantastic because they have these health registries that have the health information of every single person who lives there. Right. And this is the case for Denmark. And so what they were able to do is look at every single inhabitant of the country in those age ranges. And what they did is they looked at, during this time period, were women prescribed hormonal birth control, right? And so women were divided into one of two groups, yes or no. And then they looked at, were women then subsequently diagnosed with depression? So how does the risk of being diagnosed with depression differ, you know, after a woman is either prescribed hormonal birth control or isn't, right? And what they found was that for women who were prescribed hormonal birth control, the increased risk of developing depression after being prescribed, you know, filling that prescription, that in some cases it went up by over 200%. Right. And they looked at this across different brands and different like combinations of products that were out there. And what they found was that it differed depending on the product used. And what they also found was that it very much differed depending on the age range of the women that they were considering. And in particular, what they found was that for women who are adolescents, so women who are ages 15 to 19, when you looked at these women and their increased risk of developing depression, or being prescribed an antidepressant, their risk was substantially greater than that of women who were 20 and older. And what this suggests is that for young women whose brains are still developing, that they might not be handling the hormonal changes that are initiated by hormonal birth control pill use in the same way that a woman with a more adult brain is. And so this research is really, you know, something that's worth taking note of, particularly for, you know, anybody who knows and loves a female adolescent, because a lot of times women, you know, these really young women are being prescribed hormonal birth control as soon as they get their periods. And you know, we really need to look out for these girls because the research does seem to indicate that they're at a significantly greater risk of developing depression. And this is also like since the time of that study, a more recent study has looked at the same using the same health registries, but using a different cohort of women in Denmark. And they looked at the suicide risk. And they also found that there's a pretty substantial increase. And again, particularly among 15 to 19-year-olds who are prescribed hormonal birth control, the risk of suicide increases dramatically. And so these are things that are really important to make note of. And it's not to say that all women are going to respond poorly to hormonal birth control in terms of their mental health, because as noted earlier, for some women, it's actually therapeutic to mental health. And the thing is to just know that this is a possibility and that for some women, this is a reality. And so I'm just being aware that this is something that can potentially creep in when a person is on hormonal birth control, I think is something that's really important to make note of.
That's
Oh, thank
fascinating.
you. Oh, go ahead, Tracy. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say we've actually got some questions from our audience, so I'd like to just jump in and maybe ask you a couple of these.
Sure.
So one person mentioned that their wife had to stop taking the pill because it made her migraines worse, whereas other people are actually helped in this area by taking birth control. And so can you comment on why that might be?
Yeah, so this is like one in a lot of ways, this is a really interesting point because and it's a perfect point because it illustrates how idiosyncratic people's responses are to hormonal birth control, right? And the one thing that is very clear, and it became very clear with all of the research that I was doing for the book, is that there is no one size fits all answer when it comes to hormonal birth control. And so for many women, and I'm one of these women, no, like being off of hormonal birth control is associated with a greater risk of migraines. So for me, for example, the hormonal changes that precede ovulation, when estrogen levels spike, because estradiol is it sensitizes the brain, it makes it it changes the firing threshold of your neurons, it makes you more sensitive, and it changes your seizure threshold even. Because it increases the number of dendritic spines, it makes your brain more sensitive. And so in particularly in the hippocampus, but it also seems to be happening in the occipital lobe because for a lot of women who get visual disturbances, and I'm one of those women, the changes when estradiol is surging, I would get these ocular migraines or see these like visual things. And there's a lot of women for whom that's the case. And when I'm on hormonal birth control, of course, because it keeps estradiol levels really low, then it prevents that from really happening because the hormone levels are relatively constant. Now, for somebody who like has an increase in these types of migraines in response to hormonal birth control, this is just telling us that like our pre-existing levels of hormones were probably different, right? So like woman A, her sort of naturally cycling levels of hormones are probably one thing, and then other women who for whom it's therapeutic, that's likely something else. And it could also differ depending on the prescription, because some prescriptions are very estrogenic. So in particular, the 4th generation progestins tend to have higher levels of synthetic estradiol in them than do some of the other forms of hormonal birth control. And so that also could play a role in it. But I mean, this is, hormones mediate things like the brain sensitivity to external stimuli, and do change the seizure threshold, and do change like sort of the threshold for migraines. And so, but the research isn't in a good enough place to like make good predictions about who's going to respond what way to what thing. And so, yeah, and this is that way with just about everything when it comes to hormonal birth control, because what like really works great for one woman works terribly for somebody else. And unfortunately, because there hasn't been a lot of research on like what are the different factors that influence how people respond, it's a guessing game for a lot of women, and it can be really frustrating.
That was actually going to be my next question, because I think that's probably the question that everyone is thinking right now is, well, how do I know? Is there some way that I can tell going into my doctor's office, if you test me for this hormone or you test me for this marker, how do I know what's going to work well for me? And what I'm hearing is that there's no magic test yet.
No, there's not. And so like one thing that we're really interested in my lab that we're trying to find some funding for is looking at whether or not there are some genetic SNPs, or so whether or not if we look at some different, polymorphisms that code for things like estrogen receptor density, or things that code for like progesterone receptor density or cortisol receptor density, some of these different processes that we know are touched by hormonal birth control. Like, can we use that information to maybe predict like who's going to respond better to what type of formulation of hormonal birth control? And research like that is really important, because that's going to make this less of a trying period for women. Because I mean, I know so many women, and I went through something, very similar, where it was like I had to keep trying the next thing because I didn't like the way I felt on this, and I didn't like the way I felt on that. And then when I finally found the one I liked, I clung on to it for dear life. Like, don't you mess with me and my ortho tricycline, because that was it. Finally, I found something that worked for me. And thankfully, like there are, having released this book and sort of been out in the world, like talking to people in the last year, I've met with now 2 foundresses of femtech companies that are actually working. They're both creating apps that are designed to help better match women to the best hormonal birth control. And so what they're doing is they're using machine learning to scour the literature and find out like who's having what type of side effects. And then they're trying to use that to program it into an app where you can tell the app a little bit of something about yourself. And then it will give you some ideas about what some of the best, what the best method of hormonal birth control might be for somebody with your background. For right now, the best thing that I would recommend doing, and this isn't very parsimonious or efficient, for a lot of women, is finding out about their female relatives and what's worked well for them. Because if you're like genetically related to somebody, it seems like you're probably going to have a lot more in common with how you respond to birth control. And I was talking to a physician friend of mine, and she's an OB-GYN, and she was saying that is true, that she always tells the women, like, talk to your mom, talk to your aunts and uncles and your cousins, and that they tend to find that it does tend to work better like within families. But that's all, that's anecdotal, and like there's not a lot of research even looking at that.
So in terms of other kinds of birth control, I mean, certainly we talk a lot about the pill. I think that's the one that people know the most about. But someone asked a question about the hormonal IUD. And so the question is that this person was under the impression that the hormonal IUD does not suppress ovulation. And so based on your research, you're seeing that the hormonal IUD causes the same adverse effects as hormonal birth control, or no?
Yeah, so this one is one of my favorite questions, and I get it every time I do something like this, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about the hormonal IUD. And so a lot of doctors tell women that the hormones in the hormonal IUD act locally, right? And so this idea that the hormones, in this intrauterine device somehow, by some magic process that I don't understand, manage to not get into the bloodstream and then go everywhere that blood travels, right? Because the way that hormones work is they get into the bloodstream and then they go everywhere in the body that blood goes, right? Which is everywhere. And they get picked up by every cell in the body that has receptors for the hormones, right? And that includes the brain. And so it is absolutely 100% impossible for a hormone to act locally. That's impossible. It's physiologically impossible. But doctors are telling this to women. And so women are under the impression when they're experiencing psychological side effects on the hormonal IUD, they feel like they're crazy and that they must be imagining it because these hormones are acting locally, but that it doesn't work that way. And for some women, the levels of hormones in the hormonal IUD are not high enough to suppress ovulation. But for many women, it actually does. And so if you look at the research literature on ovulation suppression with the hormonal IUD, you'll see that it does, in fact, suppress ovulation, just not in all women and not consistently across cycles. But even when it's not suppressing ovulation, that's not because the hormones are acting locally. It's just that they're not high enough to suppress the hormonal cascade that ultimately leads in the release of an egg and ovulation. But for most women, it does suppress ovulation at least some of the time. So it is getting to the brain. The levels are just lower. I don't even know, because some women then have asked, well, does this mean that it's more natural then? Because the hormone levels are really low. So maybe it's like more natural. But the answer to that is also, well, I don't know, like, is it more natural to have your levels of hormones being super duper low when for like a naturally cycling woman, like a woman in the wild, right? You find relatively high levels of estrogen at this point in the cycle, and then relatively high levels of progesterone at this point in the cycle. And so that's like natural, right? And so this idea that really low levels of synthetic hormones, when it is having a suppressing effect on your own hormones, that creates a more natural experience. I don't know, like maybe not. because it's definitely a far cry from what like the natural sort of state of affairs is in a woman's body, because women are hormonal. You know, we have relatively high levels of sex hormones at most times in the cycle, except for when we're menstruating, and yeah, and before we, you know, and once we're menopausal, and before we become sort of get our periods.
So we've had several questions from our attendees tonight. Thank you so much for providing those questions from the audience, and keep them coming. We'll get to as many as we can this evening. The next one here is, have there been any twin studies done to determine the role of epigenetics in the response to hormonal birth control?
No, like I have not seen a single twin study on
Wow.
hormonal birth control.
That's such a good question.
But I love it though. I think that's like such an interesting, question. And you know, I have not seen I don't think I've seen, I haven't, well, I know for certain that I have not seen a single twin study. I don't know if a single twin study has even been conducted, because yeah, I mean, I did a pretty exhaustive lit search on this. What a fascinating question. I love it.
Yeah, and I also like how sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, maybe we should just take a second and just briefly explain even what epigenetics is. There may be some people in the audience that don't know that term.
Right. Are you going to make me explain that?
I can do it if you'd like.
I'll say like, yeah, I mean, like if I try to explain it, it's not going to be very technical.
I can do it if you want, Sarah.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So basically, epigenetics is the interaction between your genes and the environment. So I'll put this very simply. The way I usually explain this is that your genes are like the blueprint of a house. So these are the instructions for all of the proteins that your body might make. And then there's some environmental influence on this. The contractors come in and make decisions. Maybe there's a shortage of a certain material, and so you have to make a change. And so even though you have a blueprint, sometimes things happen because of causes in the environment that are different from what your body intended. And so things like stress in the environment can cause these kinds of changes in someone's genes.
I like that. Thanks for that explanation. That makes it more sense to me too. We have another question from one of our person in our audience.
Did you want to say something too? Did you want to add?
Oh, no.
Ahead,
I was
sorry.
just going to say that was a lot better of an explanation than I would have given. I would have just said, well, it's like stuff where your genes are like doing things, like they're doing things differently depending on the environment.
Sounds good. The next question here is on the topic of mental health. Are there many studies about negative consequences of continuous use of hormonal birth control? Personally, I felt like mine deteriorated over time, and I was wondering if there could be a reason for that. Great question. Thank you.
I love this question. And the reason I love this question so much is that it really underscores just how like sort of depressingly minimal the research literature is on this topic, because there's been almost no studies on the long-term effects of birth control pill use on women's moods or anything else, you know, because sexual functioning is another area where there's a ton of research suggesting that birth control pill use can be, you know, can minimize sexual desire and can decrease sexual functioning in women and make sex less enjoyable for them. And these are two issues where there's some hints of evidence that suggest that long-term use may have long-term consequences, but we just don't know a lot about it. There was a recently published study that came out like 2019. So I guess it's almost 2 years old, where they looked at adolescent birth control pill use and mental health side effects over the course of the lifetime. And what that study found was that using hormonal birth control during adolescence, and again, we define the adolescent period as being, you know, like prior to 19. So in this study, they were also looking at, I think that they actually lowered it in this study. I think that was 13 to 19, but essentially looking at pill use during this time. And does that then increase the likelihood of developing major depressive disorder over the course of your lifetime, even after you've gone off of the birth control pill? And what they found was that indeed it does, in that using birth control pills used during this time. Now they didn't, in this study, They didn't like specify the length of time, right? So we don't know whether or not this effect would be magnified or compounded in some way over, increasing amounts of time. But just even the idea that during, using hormonal birth control during this time where your brain is still developing may actually change, the development of the brain in ways that make it more vulnerable to developing major depressive disorder over the course of the lifetime is something that's really potentially alarming. And it's something that's really worth noting, especially for mothers of adolescents and adolescents themselves as they're thinking about being given a prescription for hormonal birth control, particularly when they're being given that prescription for something that isn't as important as pregnancy prevention. Right, because I think that we can all argue that if you have a sexually irresponsible 16-year-old, right, who's having a lot of risky sexual behavior, that it's probably a better idea to just keep her from getting pregnant than to like the whole like brain development thing sort of in some ways takes a back seat to that, given the incredible importance that fertility regulation plays in terms of women's ability to finish school, get a college degree, stay out of poverty. There's so much research, indicating how important that is. And so, but it's just one piece to consider. But I would love to see studies looking at adult women, looking just at the effects of time, right? How does 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, 10 years? I know I've met women now who've been on it for 20 and 30 years. 30 years of hormonal birth control nonstop, right? And we don't know anything about what that does long term. Like, what does that do? And I met one woman who, and this is anecdotal, so this isn't science, but she had told me she was on it nonstop for 25 years, went off of it, felt so at home at her own body that she had to go on antidepressants because she just like couldn't deal. She just said that she just felt like she didn't understand herself anymore. And so she wanted to do something, and she needed to go off of hormonal birth control because she had risk factors for stroke. And so she had to be off of it, and she didn't know what to do. And so then she had switched to an SSRI to try to manage those feelings. And so anyway, I think that this is like really important for research, obviously. Women should know this. We should know this before being given a prescription nonstop for 20 years and not having our doctor even ask, like, maybe should we try cycling off this for a cycle and just see how you do?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. And, talking about different side effects of the pill. And you mentioned this a little bit in your book, and we have a question about it. So I think this is a good time to bring it up. Oh, sorry. Let me go back really quick before I do a new question. Can we just clarify what is an SSRI?
Yeah, I just saw that. It's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And so it's an antidepressant. So things like Prozac and Zoloft and any of these over-the-counter medicines that essentially prevent the degradation of serotonin and keep it in the synapse a little bit longer, and that raises serotonin levels, which is believed to minimize depression. So it's like a prescription antidepressant.
Great, thanks. So someone else has mentioned that they've heard that hormonal birth control can influence who you find attractive. And this person's husband is a little worried. What do we know about birth control and attraction?
So we know from, and all of this research is sort of stemming from this whole line of research that's been done now for several decades, looking at the links between women's sex hormones and then their partner preferences. And so, and this is just looking at naturally cycling women, so women who are not on hormonal birth control. And what this research finds is that when women are at a point in their cycle, when estrogen is the dominant hormone, and this is generally near ovulation, so about mid-cycle, usually days 9 to 14 or so in the cycle, estrogen levels are climbing. And at this time, women express a greater preference for testosterone cues in men. So women like deeper male voices. They like men who have more social dominance. They like men with broader shoulders and sort of more masculine facial features. When you compare those preferences to what women desire at points in the cycle when estrogen is not dominant. And so other researchers more recently have started to ask the question of, well, what does this mean for women on birth control pills, right? Birth control pills keep estrogen levels really low, right? And the synthetic hormones that you're taking have really low levels of estrogen, and progesterone, or these synthetic progesterone or progestins, are really high. And so these researchers predicted, well, given that you're suppressing this estrogen rise in pill takers, might they desire less masculine male faces and less masculine men as partners relative to natural cyclers? And so they've done studies on this now in several different types of populations. But one of my favorite studies was one where they just like actually they solicited research participants, male research participants who were in relationships, right? So it was like they were advertising, are you in a relationship? Come and be in our study. And so the men arrived, they took a photograph of their face, and then they asked them, when you were at the beginning of your relationship, was your partner on hormonal birth control or off of hormonal birth control? And so the men found this information out, they reported back to the researchers, and then what they did is they just divided those piles of, they divided those male faces into two piles, right? Those that were chosen by women who were on the pill and those that were chosen by women who were naturally cycling. And what they found was that when they had the faces rated by an external panel of raters, so who were blind to the research hypothesis, and when they ran the faces through, they have these computer programs that can actually sort of calculate roughly masculinity, because there are certain types of things like the facial width to height and other things that are associated with levels of testosterone. And what they found was that the men who were chosen by pill-taking women, they had somewhat less masculine male faces. They had more feminine male faces than did the faces of the men that were chosen by natural cyclers. And again, these aren't like, we're not talking about like men who look like women, right? These are differences, but it's not like something where if you looked at the difference between a man that is like labeled as a masculine male face and a male face that looks like is labeled as like less masculine, it's not like you're looking at the difference between, you know, like Brad Pitt and like, I don't know, Dolly Parton. I mean, you know, it's like, they're like, it's like more just like shades of masculinity. And this is really provocative research, right? Because of course it suggests that our pill use can influence our partner choice. And this of course can have long-term effects potentially on relationships. Like if a person changes their hormonal birth control status, and you know, like might they be less attracted to their partner than they used to be? And there's some research evidence that suggests that that actually might be the case, and that for women who chose as partners you know, men who were less attractive, at least in this one study that looked at this, they found that the women, when they discontinued hormonal birth control, they felt less satisfied with their partners than they did prior to discontinuation, right? And this is obviously like, you know, it's provocative. Now these research that these types of results we need additional research to show whether or not this is a consistently occurring effect. But it is something that's certainly worth thinking about as you're like sort of considering whether or not you want to be on hormonal birth control when you're choosing your partner or not.
Interesting.
Of course, that's a scary idea, right? And I think a lot of, if we have men in the audience, they may be a little bit nervous about that, but jury's still out, right? More research to come.
The jury is still out, and we do need more research. And it's also important to note that you know, just because you were chosen, if you're a man and you were chosen by a partner who was on hormonal birth control, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are less masculine, right? You might not be exactly what she would have preferred at that time. But it's also, you know, so there's that possibility. But, you know, what's really interesting is like, I'll tell you the high note on all of this was that there was also a study done looking at like relationship satisfaction and sexual satisfaction among couples where the partnership formed when the woman was on hormonal birth control and those that were not. And what they found is that partnerships, so, when you have couples that were formed when the female was on hormonal birth control, the women report feeling more satisfied with the financial provisioning of their partners, the level of support of their partner, and they also have a lower rate of breakup and divorce than do those who were chosen, yes, when they were naturally cycling. Yeah, those who are naturally cycling, they report more sexual attraction, more like they report having better sex lives. They report being more sexually receptive to their partner. But they also have a higher breakup rate. And again, what I think is really fascinating about this is that it gets at, there's this whole thing, and you see this a lot in like popular culture, like with women, like the bad boy, and then like Mr. Reliable. But I think that that's a real phenomenon that women deal with. There's a real push and pull between like Mr. Sexy and Mr. Stability. And, and I think that what we have happening is that the hormonal changes that are initiated by hormonal birth control is kind of tilting you a little bit toward Mr. Reliable, right? And that's like a good guy. Like that's a guy people want to marry, right? So it's not like it's not a terrible decision. And that when you're naturally cycling, because you're experiencing these like peaks of estrogen dominance, once every 28 days approximately, that might tilt you a little bit toward the sort of Mr. Sexy, right? And Mr. Sexy isn't a great long-term mater all the time, right? Which is probably why they're breaking up more frequently. But I think it tells us also that like, it gives us really interesting insight just into women's mating psychology in general, and like how, we choose our partners, and like what are the trade-offs that we're making, and then how do our hormones influence what trade-offs we're willing to make. Super fascinating stuff.
Sounds like it. That's just so fascinating that things can change based on the pharmacology one's taking. It's interesting there.
I know. I mean, just the idea, like one thing that like really captured my imagination and like made me so excited about the idea of like writing this book and like just even thinking about this is the idea that taking a prescription medication could change something like the divorce rate. It's just almost too wild to imagine, but of course that's true. It's like already, one thing I talk about in one of the chapters in my book is just like all of the different ways that the pill might be changing the world. It's like, we know already that the average age of marriage has changed. And part of that's because we have reliable birth control, right? Because women aren't getting pregnant accidentally and getting married when they're 22 anymore because they don't have to. Right. And we know that because of that, women are also delaying having babies more. And that means that there's more fertility doctors, right? People's families are smaller. And so maybe that's increasing demand for certain types of housing and decreasing demand for other types of housing. I mean, it's like this little tiny prescription medication can have the side effect of changing careers that people go into, like a reproductive endocrinologist or fertility specialist. Like, we didn't have a lot of those, back in the day. And so just, I think it's really fascinating to think about the sort of, butterfly wing type of effects, where you get the butterfly flapping its wings over here. And then you get a tornado in Texas, and it's the same thing. You get women taking birth control over here. And then all of a sudden, you have Uber Eats because there's more single people living alone because they're not having kids. It's like a side effect of this prescription is Uber Eats.
Interesting take there. Yeah, thank you. We have another question from the audience. In your opinion, is there an ideal birth control that a woman can choose today that would minimize adverse effects to the brain? I think that's a fascinating question there.
It is. And I wish that there was a one size fits all answer. And one thing I talk about in my book is like, the only person who can know what's working for you is you. And what this means is that there's probably going to be a little bit of trial and error that's going to be involved in a lot, taking something that allows you to feel maximally at home in your own body. But one thing that I recommend for women is that they keep a journal. Like, I think that this can be really effective. And I love objective data, as objective as you can get. If you can like create and I have one of these on my website that's free to download. It's just my website's being revamped right now, so it'll be available in about a week. But it's like essentially gives you rating scales every day. Like, what is your sexual desire? What is your mood? What is your appetite? What is your energy level? And rate yourself on those every day, before you start your hormonal birth control, and then continue to do that afterward. And you can actually compare your scales, right? And look at what are your means over the course of a month to the next month. And see whether or not you're getting decreases or increases, because the best hormonal birth control is the one that you feel most at home in your own body, and right, the one that feels good to you, and it does differ individually. And so I would just say, no matter what you take, because I know that sometimes having a conversation like this one can be scary. Whatever you take, know that you're safe, right? So like, there's been so much research done showing that for most women, with rare exceptions, birth control pills are are really safe. It's cost effective. It's effective means of hormonal regulation. And so if it's working for you, know that you're doing so in a way that's not going to have these, especially if you're taking it as an adult, it's not going to have lasting impact on your brain. Once you discontinue it, your brain will adjust. It will, get back to having the same number of hormone receptors that it had before you started, or at least roughly close, hopefully. You're going to be okay. And so I think that can be a comforting message, because none of the ways that it impacts the brain are likely to be things that, are like dangerous, or things that, it's just things to be aware of. So that way, if you don't like the way that you're feeling, you can try something different.
Those scales that you mentioned, Sarah, sound like a really great resource. Could you tell everyone what your website is and how they can find those scales?
Yes, and again, you're gonna have to look next week, because right now it's not up there because my website's being updated. But it's sarahehill.com.
Perfect. I think we have time for one last question. I think this is a good one. This attractiveness question has captured our audience tonight. So we have one more question on this. And this person asks, if birth control can influence who a female finds attractive, is the opposite also true? Do men display different levels of attraction to women based on their birth control status?
I love this question. I love it. So there's a lot of research now, a long line of research demonstrating that women are maximally attractive to men in terms of the way that they smell, the way that they move. So they've done things just looking at silhouettes of people walking, the sound of their voices, and the way that women appear at high fertility compared to low. So when women are at and near ovulation, when estrogen is high, women are maximally sexually desirable to men. And women find them more attractive when estrogen is high as well. And so this, of course, then raises the question, what happens when you're on hormonal birth control and you're suppressing estrogen across the cycle, right? You're minimizing or suppressing for women, this natural, monthly boost in sexiness that women get just as a consequence of having estrogen high. And there is some evidence that suggests that women who are at high fertility are seen as more attractive. So again, women with estrogen high are perceived as being more attractive and smell better and all of these other things to men relative to what they are during times in the cycle when progesterone is dominant. And that women who are on hormonal birth control, that they're that it's similar, that they don't experience a big sexiness increase, and that they're sort of consistently here, right? Like closer to where a naturally cycling woman is in the luteal phase. And so if you are on hormonal birth control, it does suppress this like naturally occurring, free of charge, right, ecologically sustainable estrogen, increase in sexiness that you get when estrogen is dominant. And so that can actually sort of impair your attractiveness to the opposite sex, all else being equal. And let me just like add one quick little plug. Just given that I know that we're running out of time, and if people are really interested in this idea of partner choice, tomorrow night I'm actually doing an event with Ricky Lake and Abby Epstein. They created a movie called The Business of Birth Control, and I was in it. And so as promotion for that, It's me and Abby and Ricky, and then Kimberly Williams, who was in Father of the Bride. I don't know if you've seen, and then her sister, Ashley Williams, and they're wonderful. And so we did an episode. Basically, it's like a little talk show of, it's called "Did the Pill Pick My Partner?" And that's going to be tomorrow night, and you can, and it's free. And if you go to the Business of Life, I think .org. But if you just like Google body literacy, did the pill pick my partner, it'll pull up the right website, and you can get a link if you want to watch that, because we did have a really fun conversation about that topic if you want to hear more about it.
That's very cool. I wish we had more time. I feel like we could spend hours picking. We had all these questions we can get to tonight, but I think we're out of time. So I'm just going to take the couple last minutes that we have. And first, thank you, Sarah, for spending an hour of your evening. I know you taught classes today and had to rush home, and we really appreciate your time. And we appreciate everyone in the audience for spending some time this evening with us. And we hope that you will invite your friends. We're hoping to have many of these future events. So please tell your friends and family about the Fort Worth Science Cafe. Follow us on social media. We have pages on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And if you have any ideas for future events, for topics that you're interested in, things that you'd like us to cover, please feel free to let us know on our social media. Reach out and let us know. And we hope to be doing this in person at some point in the future. But we thank everyone for attending and for your understanding as we do this in a virtual platform. So
but just really quick before you add, if there were any questions that you all have that we don't have time to answer, you can always feel free to email them to me. And my email is s.e.hill, just like my name, and at tcu.edu. And you can also DM me on, I'm on Instagram. My Instagram's pretty active, and it's a lot of information about birth control and that sort of thing, because that's mostly what I use that platform for, is to educate about hormones. So.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. I'm sure everyone appreciates you being willing to answer more questions. I'm sure everyone has more questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hill, and thank you everybody for attending. Y'all have a pleasant week, and we'll see you real soon.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Good night.
Night.
Night.